surging fentanyl epidemic, otherwise known as the latest phase of the opiate crisis, a crisis that has been with us here in the United States for the past few years, surged through the pandemic. And as a matter of fact, in 2021, 107,000 plus 600, that's over 100,000 Americans died from a fentanyl overdose. So, in terms of how we hear about this case and whatnot, it tends to be tied with the overdose. Fentanyl overdoses, otherwise known as the latest phase of the opiate crisis. So, what are some of the facts surrounding this? What is the origin story? What's the supply chain? What are the communities being affected by this? And what's some of the analyses that we can apply here and projections that we can make? So, today we're going to be looking at the comments from Nick Miroff. Nick Miroff is one of several Washington Post investigative journalists. He covers the Department of Homeland Security, and they did an investigation called the Cartel RX, an investigation into the surging fentanyl epidemic and the failures of successive U.S. administrations to stop it, right? Now, with regards to these failures, this can be couched as another war on drugs, okay, of which we've seen others before. Different supply chain, different drugs, different communities being affected, those of which we know. And we're going to specify these things as we go along. We're going to specify the facts. But the United States is not, shall we say, new to the idea of failed attempts to battle drug epidemics of several kinds. So let's start with a little bit of the origin story. A lot of people think that fentanyl is made from opium, okay, but it's actually a synthetic opiate. Okay, so it's not about the poppy seeds in Afghanistan and the fact that the Americans went over there and did not burn the poppy seeds. That particular conspiracy theory does not particularly link directly to fentanyl because fentanyl is made in labs. But let us begin, ladies and gentlemen. Make sure that the volume here is at a comfortable place. Let's go.
And Nick Miroff, what is the origin of fentanyl? What was it originally intended for?
Well, fentanyl is a powerful opioid. It's a synthetic opioid. So unlike heroin, which is derived from poppy plants, fentanyl is made in a lab, and it has
poppy plants grown in Afghanistan and stuff like that. You know, opium plants. That's where you get heroin from. But fentanyl is from a lab. Okay.
From poppy plants, fentanyl is made in a lab, and it has legitimate medical usages. People may be familiar with fentanyl patches that are released, and are issued to people with severe pain or who are in a terminal phase of illness. But it's doctors have always known that it's very, very dangerous because of its potency. If it's not administered by a physician in a controlled setting, then obviously, the risk of death goes way up. But one of the most astounding things about what's happened over the last few years is that heroin has almost disappeared from U.S. streets. Whereas initially fentanyl was being added to heroin to increase its potency, it's now basically replacing fentanyl in illegal drug markets. And users who weren't necessarily looking for fentanyl before are now seeking it out. And, one of the theories behind, as some of your viewers may have seen, there have been seizures of what they call rainbow fentanyl. The pills kind of look almost like candy. One of the theories behind why the cartels are doing that is because they're trying to signal that these are actually fentanyl pills rather than fake OxyContin pills.
Okay, so they're basically trying to do some better marketing here, basically putting warning labels on it like, hey, this is fentanyl. This is not the fake OxyContin pills. Okay, this is straight up straight up fentanyl and not heroin, for example, laced with fentanyl. So that is rather interesting. Okay, this is something that is purely synthetic. There are legitimate medical uses for it. There are actually pharmaceutical companies that are involved in the production of such fake opiates, one of which is called M30. And then the labs in Mexico go ahead and also create their own version of M30. So let's talk a little bit more about the supply chain here. China, Mexico, and what's the supply chain? What routes do they take and whatnot?
It had been reported, I've heard stories that say that in the past, that the drugs had been manufactured by China, imported by the cartels in Mexico. But your reporting reveals that the cartels have labs all across the southern border area, below the southern border area.
That's right. In the initial phase, the initial stages of the fentanyl crisis, most of the fentanyl was coming from China. It was being manufactured in China and either coming through the mail in the United States or going to Mexico. The cartels were buying it and then trafficking it across the border. But over the past several years, what U.S. law enforcement has detected is this major switch that there was a crackdown in China on fentanyl manufacturing. So now the cartels are bringing the precursor chemicals from China, but also from India and other nations, and they're making it themselves. And it's actually not that complicated. They can set up these labs in a storage unit in an apartment, and they can crank out massive quantities of this stuff, and then they obtain pill presses, the pill press equipment, and they get the fillers, like just lactose or other fillers like that, and then they make these pills and then and assemble their loads and smuggle them into the United States.
Okay, so it's not just a China thing. It's not, oh, all these fentanyl labs are in China. It's not that complicated to make fentanyl. It's not that complicated to get pill presses. And Mexico is quite sophisticated when it comes to making drugs and distributing it, right? So, as a matter of fact, why would it not make sense to make the product right here, okay, right here, Northern Hemisphere, right next door to the biggest demand? And we'll get to the demand question, the demand and the supply question, and the economics, the economy of drug addiction in a second. But this is not just purely a China thing anymore, okay? So I recall that Scott Adams, the creator of Dilbert, whom sadly his son passed away as a result of fentanyl, his stepson, that is, passed away as a result of a fentanyl overdose, as a result of, he was hooked on opiate pills, and one of these was laced with fentanyl, and he passed away, I believe, in 2021. And Mr. Scott Adams went on a long screed against China as a result of this. But it seems that right now, this is not just purely a China issue anymore. Mexico has taken on the load of manufacturing these things. Now let's talk about the communities that have been affected by this. Remember, I mentioned that this can be couched in the narrative of another failed drug war. Previous drug wars, for let's say the war against crack, was a different supply chain, different manufacturing process, different drug, and different community, mainly centered in urban communities, African-American communities. We all know the stories, backstories, and around that. People want to talk about the crime bill and whatnot, right? That comes up from time to time, especially with Mr. Joe Biden during his election, because he did support the crime bill, along with many people in the African-American community, okay? Along with many leaders in the African-American community, because people didn't want these drugs in the community and the resulting drug wars and people getting shot and whatnot. They did not want that poison in there. But let's talk about the communities, the geography involved with this particular new face of the opiate crisis, which is the fentanyl epidemic.
You touched on the ports of entry. You mentioned in this story about the Colorado deaths. They talk about the accessibility to major freeways, and geography plays a real important role here, because there's also a piece in your series about the huge spike in a town like St. George, Utah.
That's right. That's right. I mean, it's really incredible. When one of the things we found is that almost all of the fentanyl entering the United States comes through either the ports of entry, the official border crossings in the San Diego area, or in southern Arizona and Nogales specifically. And from there, it goes to stash houses in Las Vegas, Los Angeles, and then spreads across the country. And New England, Appalachia, obviously, are some of the hardest hit areas. But you find little trafficking cells all over
New England, Appalachia, Utah. Okay. If we know anything about the demographics in these places, these are quite opposite from what I mentioned regarding the inner city Black communities when it came to the crack epidemic and that particular war on drugs, which was a failed attempt to fight drugs by the United States government. And now we have another failed attempt with a different face on it. Different drug. Now it's a synthetic opiate. Different localities, more rural areas, okay, Appalachia and New England, with a white face, if you will, on it as well. But let's continue.
Areas. But you find little trafficking cells all over the country, and one of our stories indeed takes readers to St. George, Utah, where the DEA built a major case and busted a fentanyl trafficker who was working with the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico. So these drug cartels are basically like illegal pharmaceutical companies at this point. They're bringing chemicals from Asia into Mexico. They're manufacturing pills. They have logistics networks across North America, and they smuggle the drugs across the country and then distribute them to hubs around the United States.
All right, all right, all right. Now, something else that comes up when one talks about the United States and the drug epidemic of any kind is we have to go to the demand side of the equation, right? Because we've been talking so far about the supply side. What's the origin of this drug? Well, synthetic, opiate, legitimate medical uses, and then started being used to lace heroin, okay, heroin which is made directly from poppy seeds, from opium poppies, okay? And we talked about China, Mexico, the labs, the distribution network, the communities that are affected. Then it comes the question, well, why don't we deal with our demand issue? This is not a China or Mexico issue, okay, whether it be cocaine or heroin or marijuana or whatever, but we are the ones demanding it. So goes this particular demand side question. What can we do to curtail the demand for this? Okay, how can we address that? What indeed can be done? Let's see.
For as long as I've lived, and it's been quite a long time, we've always attacked the suppliers of drugs, illegal drugs, as the culprits, but yet we're the ones that are buying it. And it seems to me that a better or an additional solution would be to really attack the.
And as you said, an additional solution. So basically, rather than just focus only on the supply side, how about the demand side? And what would that look like? Is that educating the population? Is that dealing with maybe what people call root causes? Appalachia is a poor area. We tend to see these kinds of drug epidemics in terms of the bad effects in poor areas. Now, rich people do take drugs. Believe me, they do. However, they have other resources by which they might curtail, assuage, or mitigate the deleterious effects of taking these drugs. But let's continue.
Or an additional solution would be to really attack the demand side of it from federal, state, and local governments to try to educate kids as young as 5 years old all the way up the danger of this stuff, because the demand, if the demand's there, the suppliers are going to find a way. So you can chase down the suppliers for as long as you want to, but they're still going to find a way. So if we didn't have the demand, you wouldn't have the suppliers.
All right, Nick Muroff, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, Wesley makes a great point, and that's something we heard over and over again from the law enforcement officers and federal agents on the front lines of this. Is that if Americans weren't buying drugs, then we wouldn't have this problem. They really emphasize the importance of education of parents and teachers talking to their kids about the dangers of fentanyl and about not buying these lethal products from evil Mexican drug cartels. But I will say one thing, which is that only looking at demand is also an oversimplification, because there is a.
Well, he didn't say only look at demand. He said an additional thing, but I guess he's going to talk about the issues with looking at the demand side, whether you look at it only or not, but what are the problems associated with it? Let's go.
Looking at demand is also an oversimplification, because there is a way in which supply can drive demand as well. When supplies are so cheap and so abundant, then it can create a demand. A lot of drug dealers in the United States are taking this cheap illegal fentanyl and they're using it to lace methamphetamine, cocaine, and other illegal drugs in order to get their customers addicted, in order to boost the potency of the drugs they're selling, to give them like a commercial advantage in the marketplace. And so there's an effort to create new addicts out there. And with fentanyl being so cheap and so plentiful, it really facilitates that.
Yeah, so his point here is it's a cogent one, it's a salient one. It makes sense. So saying that there is a way in which supply can drive up demand. If you are addicted to rich, dark chocolate, let's say, okay, and you're trying to avoid this thing, you're trying to deal with, your demand for rich, dark chocolate, but it's raining rich, dark chocolate everywhere you go. You go outside and it's in your hat, it's in your hand, it's in your jacket, it's on your shirt, okay? Then the demand is going to go up. You can't help but, the tendency of you to then go ahead and demand it, buy it, use it is going to go up. Okay. So basically saying that the plentifulness of this particular of fentanyl and the fact that fentanyl is cheap and now it's being used not just to just create the fake opioid pills that are out there, but used to lace things like cocaine and meth and what have you, that it is all over the place. It is cheap. It is plentiful. So this is a way in which the supply side of the equation is driving the demand. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's look at one more thing, which is, well, what is to be done? What are some projections that we can make regarding the fight? Okay, the fight against this. Can we partner with Mexico? This is not purely a China thing anymore. As a matter of fact, it seems to be predominantly a Mexico thing now. And what can we do in that regard?
I want to give you the chance to respond. One of your pieces in this series deals with the response of the Mexican government. The headline of the piece, they call him Eagle, how the U.S. lost a key ally in Mexico as fentanyl took off. Briefly, what is the current status of Mexico and the United States in terms of Mexico's efforts to stop this influx of fentanyl?
Well, one of the key elements to this whole crisis is that the U.S. Mexico security partnership really fell apart around 2018, just as fentanyl was taking off and the cartels were making this transition from plant-based drugs like cocaine and heroin and marijuana into synthetics, namely fentanyl and methamphetamine. And so for about 10 years, that U.S.-Mexico partnership was defined by this thing called the Merida Initiative. But by the time the current Mexican president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, got into office, his new government declared that agreement dead. It wanted to renegotiate a new one that would be more focused on social programs, on trying to discourage young people from getting involved in drugs and anti-corruption. But really, it created this rift in that partnership. And to this day, we're still, the U.S. agencies like the DEA are still trying to reaccommodate themselves to this new reality, but it has certainly limited their ability to operate in Mexico. And by many accounts, it has strengthened the Mexican trafficking organizations that the U.S. and the Mexican government have been trying to fight for so long.
Nick Miroff, hope we get more time next time.
Okay. So it seems like there's a rift in the partnership, a once established partnership to fight this. And the latest, or the current, I should say, administration in Mexico is focusing on the demand side, focusing on the education side. Let's educate the populace to, it seems like a skirting of the issue, if you ask me. It seems like they're trying to avoid the direct issue of the supply chain of those labs that are creating the drugs and putting it through Nogales, Arizona, San Diego, California, and then spreading it out there into Colorado and Utah and Appalachia and New Mexico. So what are your thoughts regarding this, the fake opiate crisis? It's not a fake crisis, but we're talking about synthetic opiates, that is. So what have we learned today? We've learned that, look, fentanyl is not made from poppy seeds, just like heroin, okay? This is created in a lab. It's a pure synthetic opiate, if you will. Similar in effects, but very, very powerful. The supply chain is not just a China thing. It is indeed now mainly a Mexico thing. They have their pill presses, they make it over there and they supply it. The communities being affected are more rural, more white, and what have you. Okay. And when it comes to the demand and supply issue, there's some complexity there. Do you think that we can work on the demand side of things, work on the education of the population as to the danger of these drugs? What are your thoughts? Leave the comments down below. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe. Once again, this is Ike Ogiamin, and until next time, peace.